Hill, who's the Environmental Services Manager at TUV Nord Group. Danny's got 10 years experience in this area, also in product and account management, marketing and sales and carbon services, and has a lot of experience as an approved TUV Nord greenhouse gas verifier. He's been certified to the ISO standard and has international training in program and greenhouse gas management. He will be sharing the platform today with Michelle O'Keefe, Director, Technical Reporting, the Carbon Disclosure Project. Michelle, obviously, overall responsibility for CDP, developing the questionnaire, developing the modules, using the data, seeing what it's telling us. She also takes a technical role in verification and has been involved in a number of research projects on climate change adaptation, climate finance, and so forth. Michelle's worked as an environmental scientist with ARUPS and holds an MSc in climate change and risk management. So what we'll do is we'll take each talk as one after the other, and if you could hold your questions for the end, that will be the best way to proceed. So over to you.
Thank you. Hello everybody. Thanks for joining us. The first part of the presentation will be really on explaining the process of verification of corporate greenhouse gas emissions. And my goal really is to take away the taboo of auditing, because that's really what it is. And I try to do that by really explaining the process in some detail. And hopefully by the end of today's session you'll see it's actually a very straightforward process with very straightforward requirements and deliverables at the end. Before I hand over to Michelle, who will be talking a little bit more on the reporting side of it all from a CDP point of view. So first of all, what's verification? This is a copy from the ISO standard. It's a systematic, independent and documented process for the evaluation of a greenhouse gas assertion against agreed verification criteria. So this is a very straightforward definition, but there's a term in there, greenhouse gas assertion, which is a term that might not be known by all of you. And an assertion is really a kind of a statement about actual circumstances or past performance. So when we talk about corporate greenhouse gas verification, most of the time we actually talk about an assertion that's referring to the greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and often also scope 3 emissions of the previous year, calendar year or financial year. So the greenhouse gas assertion says scope 1 emissions are X, scope 2 emissions are Y, and scope 3 emissions, these are the scope 3 emissions, etc. of the, for instance, 2012 monitoring period. So once we got that assertion in place, that's actually what we're going to check, whether that's correct. So that's verification, and that's what we offer as a company. So as I said, it's a very straightforward process. I'll go through these steps in the following slides before I hand over to Michelle. And the dotted line over here is really the line. Once we cross that line, that means we're really engaging with the client from a contracts point of view. So the first step is determine the fundamentals. This is all done to really get to know the client and the objectives, as well as the different fundamentals. They need to be in place before we can actually say, okay, this is what the engagement is going to look like, before we step into the following steps. So as I said, I'll go through these steps in the following slides, so I won't go into too much detail now, but as you can see, there's clearly a planning phase, an execution phase, and a completion phase. Starting off with step 1, we need to determine the fundamentals. Without these fundamentals in place, we don't know what to expect, and we don't know really what the client wants and what they want us to do. So this is a very important step, and I think it's one of the most important steps before we go ahead. So I'll go through the different fundamentals: level of assurance, objectives, criteria, scope and materiality in the next few slides. And it's during this process where you really engage with the client and get to know each other. This could involve a simple questionnaire that needs to be answered first and followed up with an on-site meeting and phone calls and interviews before we actually can make a financial or technical proposal to the client. So let's start off with level of assurance. The ISO 14064 refers to 2 levels of assurance, and the level of assurance is really the degree of confidence required by the intended user. The intended user could be the client, it could also be an institutional investor, it could be the board management, it could be anybody. The client determines who the intended user is. So the deliverable of our service is a verification report, but the level of assurance is an important fundamental to agree upon right at front, because the higher the level of assurance, the more research needs to be done, the more data needs to be checked by the verifier. A little bit more about level of assurance. There are 2 levels of assurance. One is limited, one is reasonable, and this is the terms used in ISO 14064. As you can imagine, a limited level of assurance, also known as low or review level or neutral level of assurance, compared to reasonable level of assurance, which is also known as high or positive assurance. You can imagine it involves different duration and different types of engagement. There's much more work involved to obtain a reasonable level of assurance. And the outcome is a statement that's also very different. As you can see, this is just an example of a limited level of assurance engagement statement, and it's got a double negative in there, so it's a bit more vague compared to the reasonable level of assurance, which is a much clearer and a much more confident kind of statement. And this is a phrase taken out of the final verification statement, which is delivered in step 6, which is the last slide I'll be presenting today. The second fundamental that we need to agree upon right at the front is what is the objective. So most of the time is to confirm that a certain statement on the greenhouse gas assertion is correct or adequately supported by documentation and records. Criteria, don't need to go into too much detail there, but it really needs to be defined upfront, whether you're using the greenhouse gas protocol, whether you use ISO 14064 Part 1, which is the standard defining how to calculate, monitor and report your greenhouse gas emissions. That needs to be agreed upfront. Scope is a very important fundamental. A scope really tells you what the project is about, where the properties are located that we're going to verify. Is it going to be your head office in London only, or is it going to be your international properties? That of course makes a big difference in the type of engagement. That's why it needs to be agreed upon up front. The monitoring period most of the time is the previous calendar year or the previous financial year. For instance, January 1st to 31st of December 2012. Who's the intended user and how are we going to do it? For instance, referring to ISO 14064 Part 3, which is the standard we use mostly in our service, but there are other standards that can be used as well. The final fundamental that needs to be agreed upon is materiality level. I won't go into too much detail today, but if there are further questions on any of these levels of or any of these fundamentals, we can discuss them at the end of the session. So step 2 is actually where we already have a contract with the client in place. So we agreed on all the fundamentals. We know exactly what the client wants. The client knows exactly what we can deliver. So we're really engaging here. So the first thing we need to do, we're going to review the greenhouse gas information. So you're going to send me not only the statement or the greenhouse gas assertion, but also some Excel spreadsheets, and you give me some insight in how you calculated your corporate carbon footprint. So we will be reviewing that, and based on that we determine a verification risk. And once we've done these 2 steps, we can develop a sampling and a verification plan. The sampling plan tells you how many data points the verifier wants to check, and the verification plan shows the locations and the duration of every single step in the actual on-site activities. This is a bit more in detail, reviewing the greenhouse gas information as I just mentioned. Determining the risk is a very important part. The inherent risk and the control risk is depending on the information that we receive. And the detection risk is the only risk that we as a verifier can control. And how we control that is actually by increasing the sample size. If we think the risk is high, we have to see more samples. If we think the risk is low, because the data looks very, very reliable already up front, then the sample size is going to be lower. The outcome of all this risk analysis is presented in the verification plan. So the next step, or the next phase, is the execution phase, and this is really where we go on site to conduct the field work. On site, before we go on site, we need to understand the industry. So I need to know a little bit more about the industry you're in, the type of business you're in. So I need to understand, you know, what kind of services you offer, what kind of products you manufacture, to get an insight in your services and in your manufacturing, if so. So we'll be assessing the controls and the data. So we don't only look whether the data has been collected and calculated correctly, but we also look at how did you collect them. Is there a process in place? Is it just simple Excel spreadsheets that's filled in by your peers, or do you have a sustainability software in place? Obviously, there are different ways of doing so. I'm not saying which is better or which is worse, but everything needs to be checked, not only the data but also the controls. So on site, we'll be looking at, we'll be assessing the organization's information system as well as the control for sources of potential errors. So we'll be really looking at evidence like electricity bills, gas bills, information on mileage on vehicles, business travel, which is all agreed upon upfront in the scope. And we'll be assessing this on site. Depending on the fundamentals, we'll be doing this at the head office only if all the data is centrally available, or we have to go on site at different locations. Once we've done the on-site work, we'll be assessing against the criteria. This can be done off-site, and we'll be identifying whether there are any errors or misinterpretations in the data or in the collection of the data. So the last step, the last phase is the completion phase, which is all done off-site. We'll be evaluating the assertion, whether everything that we've seen on-site and off-site is supporting your statement, your greenhouse gas assertion. And the final deliverable is actually issuing a statement, a verification statement, which is part of the verification report, which is actually determining the end of our engagement. So the verification is complete when the verification report that includes this statement has been issued, and all the findings have been closed and are free of errors. So with this, I want to finish off my part of the presentation, and at the end maybe we can discuss if there are any further questions on the process of verification.
Great, thanks, Danny. I just wanted to put the work that Danny does into the wider context of reporting. For those of you that don't know CDP, it's the Carbon Disclosure Project, and we have a mission to accelerate solutions to climate change and water management by putting relevant information at the heart of business, policy and investment decisions. And in a moment in the slides, we'll have a look at how we do that exactly. But what I wanted to do is really just look at where the demand for reporting comes from, and there's really two different areas it can come from. One is through a regulatory reporting route, and the other is through a voluntary reporting route. And what we're seeing is increasing demand from stakeholders for that climate change data. And this can include investors, purchasing organisations, governments and consumers. So it's coming through different routes and from a number of different places. So what I'm going to look at under each of these routes, first of all, under the regulatory side, I think you've probably had a few talks today around the UK regulation, so I won't dwell on that too long. It's certainly the hot topic in reporting at the moment in the UK. And then on the voluntary reporting side, I'll take you through what CDP does and why verification is important. So just looking at the UK side, obviously Nick Clegg at Rio announced the impending UK regulations around greenhouse gas emissions and directors' reports. This will be in place in 2013, At the moment, it's in the consultation phase. It's actually just finished on October the 17th. But what they're looking at is potentially providing greenhouse gas information, intensity information, methodologies, and how things have changed from the in between reporting years. So looking now more at CDP, what we do is we send out a request for climate change information on an annual basis. This comes from 655 institutional investors that represent $78 trillion worth of assets. Alongside that, we have about 50 corporate organisations who are major purchasers of other goods from other businesses. We then put that request out to over 4,000 companies in some 60 countries. So it's a large process whereby we ensure that the company gets one request, but it's able to serve all of these different audiences. These are the information to do with the climate change data. We also run a water programme and a cities programme. So over time, you can see there's been both increasing interest in the data and also increasing amounts of data reported. Here you can see our first questionnaire went out in 2003 and it had 35 institutional investors. In 2012, we were up to 655. Same on the company sides, we've gone from around 200 to just under 4,000. And we haven't got the final results in this year, but we are expecting it to be higher. So in terms of what happens to the information when it's reported to CDP, there's a wide number of stakeholders that get to access that information that companies are putting out there. If companies provide a public response, which in many of the economies they do, I think the Global 500 is about 75% public. So this can be accessed by the signatory investors, or if through our CDP supply chain program, through the purchasing organisations. But also they're available on our website. We have an analytics tool that companies can use to be able to get more out of the data. We produce CDP reports every year, and we've just gone through our reporting cycle for this year. But the information is also available through the Bloomberg terminal, Google Finance, Thomson Reuters, and other sustainability indices. So as you can see, there's a number of different people accessing this same data. So why is verification of this data important? What we're seeing is an increasing number of investors asking for the data. Those investors are used to using financial information, and what verification does is it enables the climate change data to be seen in the same way as that financial data that they're used to using. Because of this, we get an increasing demand for that data to have third-party verification. It improves the data quality, it gives you increased confidence, and as I said, it's comparable with financial data. From a company point of view, not only are they able to meet the market demand, but they can understand more about their data, because obviously the data is being provided for the investors, but also it's of value to the companies. You know, if you're saving energy, you're saving money. So companies being able to have more confidence in their data can also help them to understand where their hotspots of emissions are and potentially how they could reduce them. So how do we do that? It's important to note that CDP does not require third-party verification, but we do incentivise it because of all of those reasons. We need to make sure that we have as many companies responding as possible, but also that the leaders truly are leaders in terms of climate change data. So we have two scoring systems. We have a disclosure score, which reflects the completeness of the disclosure, and then a performance score that looks more about what a company is actually doing around their climate change data. So as you can see here, that it's quite a high proportion of the score goes to the third-party verification process. In addition, for our carbon performance leadership index, companies do need to have their scope 1 and 2 emissions verified. And all of this really reflects the importance that we know that the data users put on verification. As I said, we did just release our reports for this year. We've done a Global 500, an S&P 500, and more relevant here is our FTSE 350. And then the slide is very busy, but it's just a snapshot of some of the information that's in our FTSE 350 report, which is available on our website and is free to download. But as you can see here on the bottom left, This is the companies that are in our disclosure leadership index. So those are the companies that are doing best in terms of the completeness of their disclosure. And as you can see, the disclosure of scope 1 and 2 emissions and the verification are pretty high compared to the rest of the disclosing companies. So how can you find out more about CDP and reporting and verification? As I said, we do have reports that come out every year that summarise the data that we have reported to us. We've also worked with Danny and our other verification partners on the verification of climate data, which was a white paper really to get people to understand the verification process, how they would start it, what conversations they need to have in their companies, and all of this is available on our website. So do have a look. And any questions?
Thank you, Michelle.
I would be interested to know what you thought about sort of interacting with the different software and the sort of verification process. Does that make your job harder, easier?
No, it makes the job easier in a way, especially if it's a software system that we're familiar with. Obviously, we've been working with software systems before. I won't mention any now, but basically, if it's a software that's recognized in the market and we know it, then it, as you might remember from my slides, is we don't only check the data, we also check the controls. So checking the controls is made much easier and much more efficient if there's a good software in place. Obviously, we need to check whether the inputs are right, the data, but the calculations and etc. If it's done through software and it's a recognized software, that makes that process quicker and easier. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess the logical next question is what if it's not?
Well, then we need to go through the system itself as well and the software itself. I mean, at the moment we got clients that use a very simple Excel spreadsheet. That's the most basic software that we can think of. Anything more advanced than Excel, I would say is good, but it needs to be transparent. It shouldn't be a black box where data goes in and that's the outcome. If we can't look in that black box, that would maybe not be a good thing. We would have to then manually check whether the calculations are done properly. So, but if it's recognized software and we know the software is used, internationally and it's used broadly, then there's more confidence, and then this verification risk that I talked about is reduced significantly. So, from Excel to very well recognized, you determine the risk as a verifier.
Any more questions out there? Yes? If you could say who you are, please.
Oh, sorry, Hugo from Danco.
Okay.
Third-party logistics.
Yep.
The fact of using Excel, does that, you mentioned before reasonable or limited?
Yeah.
The fact of not using carbon software, would that influence on that decision, or is just another factor that you take into account when evaluating?
Well, first of all, reasonable or limited. To obtain a reasonable level of assurance, we just need to check more data. So whether it's Excel or fancy software or no software at all, we just need to check more data to get a reasonable level of assurance. You can never get 100% assurance. I mean, you can, but then you would probably have to spend a lot more time, which is, the clients don't want us to pay for. But to get a reasonable level of assurance, you need to check more data, so compared to limited level of assurance. So whether it's Excel or anything, that doesn't make a difference. So I don't really understand the question.
Yeah, that was...
Oh, right. Okay. So it's just sample size. Limited or reasonable, the difference is sample size.
Wow, two more there. I'll take the gentleman there with a tie and check it.
More and more companies are not only reporting GHG emissions only, but also, for instance, in their annual report, natural resource consumption in general, so water, waste, etc.
Yeah.
So all the, say, criteria underneath the GHG top criteria, let's put it that way. Is your verification methodology impacted in any way by these new criteria, and it could be top criteria like, I don't know, water footprint or waste footprint, or is your methodology robust to all environmental criteria?
Yeah, what I presented on today is based on ISO 14064, which clearly refers to greenhouse gas emissions. So we only look at the carbon data. I mean, we can look at other environmental impacts as well, like wastewater, etc. But that's a different service that we can offer as well. But the service I talked about today, verification of corporate greenhouse gas emissions, is not looking at water or any other parameters.
How would, in a couple of words, how would the methodology, the verification methodology be impacted?
Well, there are certain criteria you would look at. I mean, there are certain standards I can refer to. AA1000 is one of them. And compared to greenhouse gas verification, where you really look at data points and check whether the equations or whether the formulas or whether the data is correct, you can follow a certain methodology. When you look at other parameters, you need to apply different methodologies. You can't just add up numbers and check whether it's done correctly. You need to look at certain criteria which are predetermined in our standards, and you tick those boxes, and if they're ticked, then you can issue an assurance statement.
We'll take one more question. The gentleman there, the white shirt.
Just a question about the information that's reported to the carbon disclosure for operators under the ETS. How does the information and what level of assurance compare to what's actually reported?
So under the EU ETS, they're required to have reasonable assurance under ISO 14064. I shouldn't say that while Danny stood next to me in case I get it wrong. That is right, isn't it? So when companies report to CDP, one of the things that we were very clear on when we wanted to try and incentivise more third-party verification is that we had to allow for those processes that were already happening. So companies can get full credit for their verification because they have that reasonable assurance as part of their EU ETS requirements. So we have a facility whereby they can report that, and they can provide their screenshots to show that it's been entered into the EU ETS database as verified data.
But then they're required to report other gases on top of that.
Yes, so they would be, normally the EU ETS would only cover some of their facilities. So what we ask for in CDP is we actually ask for the full corporate boundary. So that would be, they would report on a global basis. We have some breakdowns by country and by facility, but across the board, across the whole climate change request, it is on a global corporate basis.